Peace be up on you. My name is Johann Say Trillion. This, as far as I can tell, is episode 8. And this is part 4 of the Adam and Eve Fiasco. So we finna close it out. And that's gonna be with the second garden. That's the name of paper 76 that this info comes from. It's called the second garden. So, man, Adam and Eve, they messed up. And they dropped the ball in a major way. And now they got to start all over, damn near, from a whole different standpoint. And it's fascinating. So I'm going to read the first couple paragraphs. When Adam elected to leave the first garden to the Nodites unopposed, he and his followers could not go west, for the Edenites had no boats suitable for such a marine adventure. They could not go north. The northern Nodites were already on the march toward Eden. And again, that was from all the Edenites destroying the nearby Nodite settlement that Serapatatia and Cano came from. And just for reminders, the garden was situated on like an island projecting westward from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. So again, they can't go north, and they couldn't go west because that would have been, they would have had to cross some water. They feared to go south. The hills of that region were infested with hostile tribes. The only way open was to the east, and so they journeyed eastward toward the then pleasant regions between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Back here again. And many of those who were left behind later journeyed eastward to join the Adamites in the new valley home. Check it. Cain and Sansa were both born before the Adamic caravan had reached its destination between the rivers in Mesopotamia. Leota, the mother of Sansa, perished at the birth of her daughter. Eve suffered much but survived owing to superior strength. Eve took Sansa, the child of Leota, whom Adam laid down with after Eve had laid with Cain. So this woman, Leota, produced Sansa, and Eve took her to her bosom, and she was reared along with Cain. Sansa grew up to be a woman of great ability. She became the wife of Sargon, the chief of the northern blue races, and contributed to the advancement of the blue men of those times. All right, part 1. The Edenites enter Mesopotamia. It required almost a full year for the caravan of Adam to reach the Euphrates River. Finding it in flood tide, they remained camped on the plains west of the stream almost 6 weeks before they made their way across to the land between the rivers, which was to become the second garden. I'm gonna skip down a little bit, but basically they saying everybody had fled when they heard Adam was coming, even though he was a man of peace. But this territory was left up to them. The site was known to Adam as one of the 3 original selections of the committee. Remember, it was a committee that Van and Amadon had put together that found the initial Garden of Eden. And they had 3 sites that they came back with after scouting for like 3 years. And so this was the second site that they picked. The 2 rivers themselves were, again, the Tigris and Euphrates. The 2 rivers themselves were a good natural defense in those days. And a short way north of the second garden, the Euphrates and Tigris came close together so that a defense wall extending 56 miles could be built for the protection of the territory to the south and between the rivers. After getting settled in the new Eden, it became necessary to adopt crude methods of living. It seemed entirely true that the ground had been cursed. nature was once again taking its course. Now were the Adamites compelled to wrest a living from unprepared soil and to cope with the realities of life in the face of the natural hostilities and incompatibilities of mortal existence. They found the first garden partially prepared for them, but the second had to be created by the labor of their own hands and in the quote, sweat of their faces. Part 2, Cain and Able. Less than 2 years after Cain's birth, Abel was born, the first child of Adam and Eve to be born in the second garden. When Abel grew up to the age of 12 years, he elected to be a herder. Cain had chosen to follow agriculture. Now, in those days, it was customary to make offerings to the priesthood of the things at hand. Herders would bring of their flocks, farmers of their fruits of the fields, and in accordance with this custom, Cain and Abel likewise made periodic offerings to the priest. The two boys had many times argued about the relative merits of their vocations, and Abel was not slow to note that preference was shown for his animal sacrifices. In vain did Cain appeal to the traditions of the first Eden, to the former preference for the fruits of the fields, but this Abel would not allow, and he taunted his older brother in his discomfiture. So they've already and they're going to get into it, slightly retrogressed in their whole idea of religion, but they're offering things to the priest of that time, and Abel was offering animal sacrifices, and it was deemed of more value than, the fruits or veggies, that Cain was offering. Excuse me. In the days of the first Eden, Adam had indeed sought to discourage the offering of animal sacrifice so that Cain had a justifiable precedent for his contentions. It was, however, difficult to organize the religious life of the second Eden. Adam was burdened with 1,001 details associated with the work of building, defense, and agriculture. Being much depressed spiritually, he entrusted the organization of worship and education to those of Nodite extraction who had served in these capacities in the first garden. And in even so short a time, the officiating Nodite priests were reverting to the standards and rulings of pre-Adamic times. So yeah, Adam had a lot going on, starting his whole second garden, and he delegated almost the whole religious aspect to what they were doing to the Nodite priests. Now the Nodites had been around for a long time, even before Adam had got there. And again, the Nodites ultimately descend from Caligastia's rebel staff. So you can only imagine the religious, teachings that they were on. But the two boys never got along well, and this matter of sacrifices further contributed to the growing hatred between them. Abel knew he was the son of both Adam and Eve and never failed to impress upon Cain that Adam was not his father. That's hard, man. Damn. Cain was not pure violet as his father was of the Nodite race. Later it mixed with the blue and the red man and with the aboriginal Andonic stock. And all of this, with Cain's natural bellicose inheritance, caused him to nourish an ever-increasing hatred for his younger brother. So man, Abel was taunting Cain, and Cain already had a short fuse. The boys were respectively 18 and 20 years of age when the tension between them was finally resolved. One day, when Abel's taunt so infuriated his bellicose brother that Cain turned upon him in wrath and slew him. The observation of Abel's conduct, now this is like they slick get into some psychology, and it's interesting real quick. The observation of Abel's conduct establishes the value of environment and education as factors in character development. Abel had an ideal inheritance. His mom and dad was both pure, violet race. His mom and dad was Adam and Eve, the king and queen of this planet. Abel had an ideal inheritance, and heredity lies at the bottom of all character. But the influence of an inferior environment virtually neutralized this magnificent inheritance. Abel, especially during his younger years, was greatly influenced by his unfavorable surroundings. He would have become an entirely different person had he lived to be 25 or 30. His superb inheritance would have then shown itself. While a good environment cannot contribute much toward really overcoming the character handicaps of a base heredity, a bad environment can very effectively spoil an excellent inheritance, at least during the younger years of life. So I'm going to skip a little bit. The death of Abel became known to his parents when his dogs brought the flocks home without their master. To Adam and Eve, Cain was fast becoming the grim reminder of their folly, and they encouraged him in his decision to leave the garden. Damn, Cain really, he had it rough, bro, from the get-go. Cain's life in Mesopotamia had not been exactly happy, since he was, in such a peculiar way, symbolic of the default. It was not that his associates were unkind to him, but he had not been unaware of their subconscious resentment of his presence. Man, that's a hard way to live, man. Just knowing like you a huge mistake. That shit crazy. But Cain knew that since he bore no tribal mark, he would be killed by the first neighboring tribesmen who might chance to meet him. Fear and some remorse led him to repent. Cain had never been indwelt by an adjuster. Again, an adjuster is that fragment of the creator of all that indwells us. And it lives in your mind. And it's all that God is in the form of a spirit, you know. And they call it a thought adjuster. Cain had never been indwelt by an adjuster, had always been defiant of the family discipline and disdainful of his father's religion. But he now went to Eve, his mother, and asked for spiritual help and guidance. And when he honestly sought divine assistance, an adjuster indwelt him. And this adjuster, dwelling within and looking out, gave Cain a distinct advantage of superiority which classed him with the greatly feared tribe of Adam. So I'm just presuming, like, I'm not sure if adjusters really indwelt a lot of primitive man at this time, like, because they indicate that we're pretty much after the age of 5. If you have a normal mind in this day and age, you receive a thought adjuster. But it must have been a different time back then. Anyway, and so Cain departed for the land of Nod, east of the second Eden. He became a great leader among one group of his father's people and did, to a certain degree, fulfill the predictions of Sarapatasia, for he did promote peace between this division of the Nodites and the Adamites throughout his lifetime. Cain married Ramona, his distant cousin, and their first son, Enoch, became the head of the Elamite Nodites. And for hundreds of years, the Elamites and the Adamites continued to be at peace. Part 3. Life in Mesopotamia. As time passed in the second garden, the consequences of default became increasingly apparent. Adam and Eve greatly missed their former home of beauty and tranquility, as well as their children who had been deported to Edentia. It was indeed pathetic to observe this magnificent couple reduced to the status of the common flesh of the realm. but they bore their diminished estate with grace and fortitude. Adam wisely spent most of the time training his children and their associates in civil administration, educational methods, and religious devotions. Had it not been for this foresight, pandemonium would have broken loose upon his death. As it was, the death of Adam made little difference in the conduct of the affairs of his people. But long before Adam and Eve passed away, they recognized that their children and followers had gradually learned to forget the days of their glory in Eden. So I'm gonna skip down a little bit. But yeah, they sometimes, man, certain circumstances when you find yourself in a certain time and space, and it's a real pressing reality that you either gotta survive it or die within it. If you want to continue, you gotta forget about them glory days. Sometimes you might have to start all over again, and that's just what they had to do. The civil rulers of the Adamites were derived hereditarily from the sons of the first garden. Adam's first son, Adamson, founded a secondary center of the violet race to the north of the second Eden. Adam's second son, Eve's son, and these are the first children that they had in the first garden, Adamson and Eve's son. Eve's son became a masterly leader and administrator. And he was the great helper of his father. And they also, real quick, they had a priesthood. The religious rulers or priesthood originated with Seth, the eldest surviving son of Adam and Eve, born in the second garden. So Seth was the first son born in the second garden, and he was born 129 years after Adam's arrival on Urantia. Seth became absorbed in the work of improving the spiritual status of his father's people, becoming the head of the new priesthood of the second garden. His son Enos founded the new order of worship, and his grandson Kenan instituted the foreign missionary service to the surrounding tribes near and far. And the Sethite priesthood was a threefold undertaking embracing religion, health, and education. The priests of this order were trained to officiate at religious ceremonies, to serve as physicians and sanitary inspectors, and to act as teachers in the schools of the garden. Adam's caravan had carried the seeds and bulbs of hundreds of plants and cereals of the first garden with them to the land between the rivers. They also had brought along extensive herds and some of all the domesticated animals. Because of this, they possessed great advantages over the surrounding tribes. They enjoyed many of the benefits of the previous culture of the original garden. They talk a little bit about how their diet went on to change slightly. Adam and Eve always continued to eat fruits, nuts, herbs, and but subsequently some of the children started taking on dairy, but none of them ate meat. The Adamites greatly excelled the surrounding peoples in cultural achievement and intellectual development. They produced the third alphabet and otherwise laid the foundations for much that was the forerunner of modern art, science, and literature. Here, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, they maintained the arts of writing, metalworking, pottery making, and weaving, and produced a type of architecture that was not excelled in thousands of years. So they still managed to make a significant culture even despite all these circumstances. having to relocate to the second garden and start all over. I'm gonna skip down to part 4, the violet race. Adam and Eve were the founders of the violet race of men, the 9th human race to appear on Urantia. So according to the papers, there's the Andonic race, which is the original man that evolved into what they deem mankind. And they deem man like they consider you a mortal being when you have the ability to have a thought adjuster indwell you. Like you have the capacity for that. You have the mind to make choices that determine the fate of your soul. Like, animals just can't do that. So when man evolved to that point, they said there's mankind right there. So, and this was Andon. You got the Sangeet races that 500,000 years came from Andon, from a particular family. They produced 6 different colored children. Yeah, I know how it sounds. So that made what, 7. You got the Nodites. Those came from Caligastia's staff. When they made it with mortal beings, that created a whole nother race. That's 8. And now you got the Adamites from Adam, the violet race of people that was ultimately sent down here to upgrade everybody. And that's the 9th race. Now, it says Adam and his offspring had blue eyes, and the violet peoples were characterized by fair complexions and light hair color, yellow, red, and brown. I don't know. That's what they say. Hey, man, I know we having so much, race is such a contentious subject that you wonder sometimes, like, who wrote this? I don't know. Cause I had them same wonderings. I'll just be honest with you. But as time went on, I could believe it. Eve did not suffer pain in childbirth. Neither did the early evolutionary races. Only the mixed races produced by the union of evolutionary man with the Nodites and later with the Adamites suffered the severe pains of childbirth. And just to clarify, I could believe it because I know the broader context of everything that's being said in these papers. Just to backtrack a little bit. Now this last where it says Eve did not suffer pain in childbirth, neither did the early evolutionary races. Only the mixed races produced by the union of evolutionary man with the Nodites and later with the Adamites suffered the severe pains of childbirth. That's interesting. Like, for some reason, these different bloods trying to produce another human being can cause some pain. Adam and Eve, like their brethren on Jerusalem, were energized by dual nutrition, subsisting on both food and light, supplemented by certain superphysical energies unrevealed on Urantia. Now that's interesting. But we did talk about that earlier, how they imbibed light for energy. Their Urantia offspring did not inherit the parental endowment of energy intake and light circulation. They had a single circulation, the human type of blood sustenance. So every being they produced, starting with Adam's son and Eve's son, they were mortal human beings. They were just of the violet race. They were pure violet race, but they didn't have that same endowment as Adam and Eve did. They weren't connected to the life currents of Satania. They had a single circulation, the human type of blood sustenance. They were designedly mortal, though long-lived, albeit longevity gravitated toward the human norm with each succeeding generation. So They used to live a long time, a lot longer than the average mortal being. But as time went on, that ability weakened. Adam and Eve and the first generation of children did not use the flesh of animals for food. They subsisted wholly upon the fruits of the trees. After the first generation, all of the descendants of Adam began to partake of dairy products, but many of them continued to follow a non-flesh diet. This is interesting. Both the physical and spiritual visions of Adam and Eve were far superior to those of the present day peoples. Their special senses were much more acute, and they were able to see the midwayers and the angelic hosts, the Melchizedeks, and the fallen prince Caligastiel, who several times came to confer with his noble successor. Mind you, no human being could see Caligastiel. He's a spiritual being. And our eyes just aren't adjusted for that. They retained the ability to see these celestial beings for over 100 years after the default. These special senses were not so acutely present in their children and tended to diminish with each succeeding generation. The Adamic children were usually adjuster indwelt since they all possessed undoubted survival capacity. These superior offspring were not so subject to fear as the children of evolution. So much of fear persists in the present day races of Urantia because your ancestors received so little of Adam's life plasm, owing to the early miscarriage of the plans for racial physical uplift. Damn, fear is an emotion, and emotions take place within the body. Like, fear is going to come from this electrochemical mechanism we call a body. And they're saying, that's interesting, man, that if we had more of Adam's blood, we wouldn't even be so scared. The body cells of the material sons and the the body cells of the material sons and their progeny are far more resistant to disease than are those of the evolutionary beings indigenous to the planet. The body cells of the native races are akin to the living disease-producing microscopic and ultra-microscopic organisms of the realm. These facts explain why the Urantia peoples must do so much by way of scientific effort to withstand so many physical disorders. You would be far more disease-resistant if your races carried more of the Adamic life. It's a trip, man. What we missed out on. After becoming established in a second garden on the Euphrates, Adam elected to leave behind as much of his life plasm as possible to benefit the world after his death. Accordingly, Eve was made the head of a commission of 12 on race improvement, and before Adam died, this commission had selected 1,682 of the highest type of women on Urantia, and these women were impregnated with the Adamic life plasm. Their children all grew up to maturity except 112, so that the world in this way was benefited by the addition of 1,570 superior men and women. Though these candidate mothers were selected from all the surrounding tribes and represented most of the races on earth, the majority were chosen, from the highest strains of the Nadites, and they constituted the early beginnings of the mighty Andite race. They go on to deal with the Andite race later. Death, part 5, Death of Adam and Eve. Not long after the establishment of the second Eden, Adam and Eve were duly informed that the repentance was acceptable and that While they were doomed to suffer the fate of the mortals of their world, they should certainly become eligible for admission to the ranks of the sleeping survivors of Urantia. What they just said, the sleeping survivors of Urantia. Basically, that's what they refer to as all the dead who are awaiting a resurrection, which happens every so often. So they were told that, okay, y'all have been degraded to mortal status, like you like the rest of humanity right now. But since you have an adjuster, you are afforded the same opportunity at survival as them. They fully believe this gospel of resurrection and rehabilitation, which the Melchizedek so touchingly proclaimed to them. Their transgression had been an error of judgment and not the sin of conscious and deliberate rebellion. Adam and Eve did not, as citizens of Jerusalem, have thought adjusters, nor were they in juster adwelt when they functioned on Urantia in the first garden. But shortly after their reduction to mortal status, they became conscious of a new presence within them and awakened to the realization that human status coupled with sincere repentance had made it possible for adjusters to indwell them. So mind you, man, Adam and Eve, all that time, is so many different orders of being and so much going on throughout creation, man. All different kinds of beings, all different types of statuses. Everybody don't have an adjuster. Technically, everybody don't need one. They were born a certain way up on high. Remember, they came from Edentia. That's the capital of our constellation. They were high beings and they had been functioning there for thousands upon thousands of years. And up on high, as they were, they didn't need adjusters. But since they committed this and had been reduced to mere mortals, now they receive thought adjusters like we do. So Adam knew about the dispensational resurrection, which occurred simultaneously with his arrival on the planet. The dispensational resurrection I referred to in the last, in one of the episodes, that when they got down here, that was like a major chapter in this world. And that day, they had a resurrection of sleeping survivors when he arrived here. And he was aware of that happening. So he knew like what that was about. He did not know that Michael, the sovereign of this universe, was so soon to appear on Urantia. He expected that the next son to arrive would be of the Avanal order. I'm going to skip that because that'll get confusing. But they do talk about Michael sending them a personal message like, I understand y'all didn't purposely, go against me and whatnot, so it's all good. Skip and they kind of talk about some politics that take place within this planet, and that they understand that Michael's gonna come down here in the future. They don't know when, this, that, and the third. But I'm gonna skip down a little bit. Adam lived for 530 years. He died of what might be termed old age. His physical mechanism simply wore out. The process of disintegration gradually gained on the process of repair, and the inevitable end came. Eve had died 19 years previously of a weakened heart. They were both buried in the center of the temple of divine service, which had been built in accordance with their plans soon after the wall of the colony had been completed. And this was the origin of the practice of burying noted and pious men and women under the floors of the places of worship. The supermaterial government of Urantia, under the direction of the Melchizedeks, continued, but direct physical contact with evolutionary races had been severed. This is interesting, man. From the distant days of the arrival of the corporeal staff of the planetary prince, down through the times of Van and Amadon to the arrival of Adam and Eve, physical representatives of the universe government had been stationed on the planet. But with the Adamic default, this regime, extending over a period of more than 450,000 years, came to an end. So they saying like for 450,000 years, you all had some material beings that represented divinity. And now with Adam and Eve fumbling like they did, that was the end of that. They were the last ones for a while, up until Melchizedek, whom we're going to get into next. But with the Adamic default, this regime, extending over a period of more than 450,000 years, came to an end. In the spiritual spheres, angelic helpers continued to struggle in conjunction with the thought adjusters, both working heroically for the salvage of the individual, but no comprehensive plan for far-reaching world welfare was promulgated to the mortals of earth until the arrival of Melchizedek in the times of Abraham, who, with the power, patience, and authority of a son of God, did lay the foundations for the further uplift and spiritual rehabilitation of unfortunate Urantia. Misfortune, this is interesting too. It's always an upside, man. Misfortune has not, however, been the sole lot of Urantia. This planet has also been the most fortunate in the local universe of Nebadon. Urantians should count it all gain if the blunders of their ancestors and the mistakes of their early world rulers so plunged the planet into such a hopeless state of confusion, all the more confounded by evil and sin, that this very background of darkness should so appeal to Michael of Nebadon that he selected this world as the arena wherein to reveal the loving personality of the Father in heaven. It is not that Urantia needed a creator son to set its tangled affairs in order. It is rather that the evil and sin on Urantia afforded the creator son a more striking background against which to reveal the matchless love, mercy, and patience of the Paradise Father. Know what they telling you, man? They're saying, like, despite all the crazy shit that's happened on your world, with the Caligastia betrayal, Adam and Eve, defaulting, all this because we got caught up in the Lucifer rebellion due to Caligastia. Michael chose your planet out of his whole entire local universe to come down on this bestowal mission. Now that's a huge deal. And it never happens again. Like, that's it. So it's major. And you're going to see how major this is soon. Because all this is leading up to Michael's story on this planet. And it's going to blow your mind. 6. Survival of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve went to their mortal rest with strong faith in the promises made to them by the Melchizedeks that they would sometime awake from the sleep of death to resume life on the mansion worlds also familiar to them in the days preceding their mission in the material flesh of the violet race on Urantia. So they just kind of go on to tell how they passed on through the mansion worlds at a slightly accelerated pace than most, but still, nevertheless, they had to go through a lot of successive stages like we all do on the other side, excuse me. And now they're almost like they sit on a council that deals with this planet's affairs. I'm gonna read this last paragraph. And thus ends the story of the planetary Adam and Eve of Urantia, a story of trial, tragedy, and triumph, at least personal triumph for your well-meaning but deluded material son and daughter, and undoubtedly, in the end, a story of ultimate triumph for the world and its rebellion-tossed and evil-harassed inhabitants. When all is summed up, Adam and Eve made a mighty contribution to the speedy civilization and accelerated biologic progress of the human race. They left a great culture on Earth, but it was not possible for such an advanced civilization to survive in the face of the early dilution and the eventual submergence of the Adamic inheritance. It is the people who make a civilization. Civilization does not make the people. They left a little bit of blood, but it kind of quickly got diluted, and it is what it is. This paper was presented by Solania, the same seraphic voice in the garden.